All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Jeremiah Andrews, and today I'm going to be presenting to you all on my case analysis. I just want to go over the scenario to start off and just give you all a basic synopsis of what's actually going on within the case. Dr. Myra Morgan, a forensic psychologist, is a member in the Society of Indian Psychologists, and this will be abbreviated throughout the rest of this presentation by SIP. And the SIP is writing a position paper in support of a member of a Northeast American Indian tribe who was denied workers' compensation for a claim of post-traumatic stress disorder. This was experienced when the worker went through a serious injury resulting from a fall from a malfunctioning scaffold on a building for which he was a part of the construction crew. The company's insurer actually agreed to pay for the physical medical costs of the injury, but is claiming that based on the evaluation of an independent psychologist, that the worker is feigning PTSD symptoms. Now, so what is being accused of, the insurance company is accusing this construction worker of, if you will, faking his symptoms and kind of milking it, if you will. Now, currently, there are no malingering instruments that have sufficiently been validated for members of American Indian tribes. And although small samples of American Indians have been included in some large-scale malingering test validation studies, the numbers have actually been too small to analyze separately. Moreover, tribes in the United States are actually highly diverse. So in American Indian tribes throughout the United States are very diverse. So the fact of the generalizations across, if you try to generalize the American Indian tribes just across the globe and across America in general, it could be seen is kind of inappropriate because of how diverse they actually are. Now, for the assessment, the independent psychologist had selected both the widely used malingering test and the test that has shown some cultural sensitivity for other ethnic groups. Across the test, the assessment results were inconsistent with tests that had claimed to be more sensitive to cultural differences, indicating higher but inconclusive evidence for malingering. Based on her expertise, the SIP leadership asked Dr. Morgan to take the lead in writing a position paper in favor of this construction worker. Now, she wants to write a strong paper, Dr. Morgan does, but given the test results available, she's concerned about how to write a public statement consistent with standard 5.01, avoidance of false or deception statements. So, a very, very intriguing case. And I think for me, it gave me a chance to really sit back and really analyze the situation in total and all the parties involved. So now we'll move on to the parties involved. So I got here Dr. Myra Morgan as one of the main parties involved. Now, Dr. Myra Morgan, obviously, she's the one that has been asked by the SIP to write a letter of support for this worker who experienced an accident at a construction site. So you have that going on. You have the fact that the worker is affected due to the fact that while the insurance did pay for those physical injuries, they're accusing the worker of the construction worker, of malingering their PTSD symptoms. The independent psychologist also comes into play because this is who the construction company's insurance hired to evaluate the worker's PTSD symptoms. And the Society of Indian Psychologists, they're advocating for the construction company to actually provide workers' compensation for this individual who was denied. And all of these parties are kind of intertwined, if you will, in a way, because it's of the direct responsibility. The independent psychologist had a direct involvement in, putting together an assessment and determining that the worker was malingering their PTSD symptoms. This has huge effects on Dr. Myra Morgan. It has effects on her integrity. And if she writes this position of paper, if she ends up endorsing someone who might indeed be having, might be malingering as it regards to their PTSD symptoms, this could also look bad on her. So there's just a lot of things going on here. So now we'll move on to the major ethical dilemmas involved. So for me, the thing that I just want to, I guess, take the time to talk about these first three bullet points that you see here. So integrity, right? So how I looked at it is, Dr. Morgan needs to be able to determine if that independent psychologist is credible at all. If the assessment that the independent psychologist put together is credible at all. And from what it seems, and from what the case study actually tells us, is that it mentions that the assessment that the independent psychologist actually put together was inconsistent. The results were inconsistent, and they also went on to, since there was no malingering assessments or instruments that were actually already in play for members of American Indian tribes, this independent psychologist, in my opinion, made a mistake by moving forward and just generalizing all American Indian tribes across America, because the case study also lets us know that this is highly inappropriate and it can lead to inaccurate results. So there's that going on. Also mentioned is the avoidance of false or deception statements. So what we know is that Dr. Morgan has an ethical responsibility to not promote deceptive statements. So once again, it is very, very, very important for her to make sure that she's properly evaluated the assessment used by the independent psychologist. And I think it's important for her not only to know for moving forward, for research moving forward, but important to know in determining whether she's going to write this letter or not. Because if she goes in and writes this letter of support for this individual, and the assessment that that this independent psychologist did actually checks out, well, then, once again, that looks bad on Dr. Morgan, and it also has other, different implications. And so it's imperative and very, very important for Dr. Morgan to evaluate the assessment that the independent psychologist used to determine whether the worker had PTSD symptoms or not. And by being able to see how credible it is, that's how she'll be able to determine, in my opinion, whether she should or whether she shouldn't write the letter. So moving on to justice was another major ethical dilemma that I saw. So Dr. Morgan must exercise reasonable judgment and take precautions to make sure that her own potential biases do not, influence her overall judgment when she decides to, write the letter or not. Because I think for here, obviously, Dr. Morgan is a member of the SIP. So since she has the same cultural background as the worker, there is a chance that this kind of situation may cause some triggers for her own, may cause her to sit back and really, become initially maybe kind of emotional and, a little upset about the fact that this worker was denied the PTSD workers' compensation. So it's important for her to make sure that she checks her own potential biases, if there are any, and just to make sure that before she decides whether or not to write the letter of support, she kind of sits back and says, okay, well, what else do I have what else do I have going on in play here that may or may not affect my overall decision making? So the codes that were just involved, obviously malingering in general, this code just essentially hit on, the fact of what malingering actually is, and explaining it and going in depth there. Mentioned was the avoidance of false or deceptive statements. Now, it is the responsibility of Dr. Morgan to make sure that she's not putting out false statements and not endorsing something that is not effective, or something that is not something that's not true. So she has to make sure that in her position, she doesn't write this letter of support in regards to the construction worker if it's not needed, if it's truly not warranted. So that's why it's important for her to do her own kind of research and ensure that, ensure the credibility of the assessment, and just to take it from there. So when thinking about my own personal values here, just about what I have and how they may play into it. So I'm big on fairness, right? So I'm really I really have a strong belief that people should generally, for the most part, be treated fair. So initially, when I read the case study, I was a little taken aback by the fact that the American, the construction company's insurance did not provide the workers' compensation, because initially I was confused because, of course, they suffered the injury on the job, but the fact that I think the accusation of malingering that the independent psychologist ended up resulting to, for me, it just took me aback. So I had to take a step back and say, okay, well, let me continue reading. Let me not get triggered. Let me just make sure and let me, evaluate the whole situation. So that was there. Honesty. Now, when considering what Dr. Morgan should do, I think a big part of it is honesty and transparency. So to state, in my opinion, is very, very, very important for her to state all of the different issues that are at play with the assessment. So it's important for her to acknowledge that, to let, when she writes her letter of support, to let whoever may be reading it know that, hey, the generalization of American Indian tribes across America is not okay. That's something that is irresponsible. That's something that has, and like it said in the case study, studies have shown that American Indian tribes are very, very diverse. So to assume that one American Indian tribe might react the same way as another is already, you have, a problem. So I think if that ends up being the course of action to write that was something that to me really stood out. Like, okay, it's important to be transparent when you give your if you do decide to give that letter of support, it's important to be transparent. Justice, I feel like people naturally should, whenever a situation has happened and somebody has gotten a short end of a stick, if you will, justice is something that I value. And when reading this case, I think there are a couple of ways to look at it. And one way, you can sit back and say, okay, this is completely, you could say it might be justified if you take into account that the company did bring in an independent psychologist to do their own kind of background and assessment. But you can also look at it in a different light. Even though the company did bring in an independent psychologist, it's about the assessment that the independent psychologist took to determine whether or not the construction worker had these PTSD symptoms. So justice was something that, might be in play here in my own personal values that, I had to reflect on and take a look at. As far as possible courses of action could go, so this could really end up in only a couple of ways, in my opinion. Now, for one, Dr. Morgan could potentially, write this full letter of support for the worker on behalf of the SIP. In this letter, she could be transparent and give details about the different assessments that are conducted by the independent or the single assessment that is conducted by the independent psychologist. So in doing this, Dr. Morgan could write this full letter of support, be transparent, let everybody know, whoever may be reading the letter, about how generalizations across tribes are just inappropriate, and that this can't lead to actual authentic or credible results regarding malingering. And also to just, simply write out and explain how there is actually no malingering instrument used for American Indian tribes that has been introduced yet. There is no instrument regarding malingering that has been introduced for these group of individuals. So that's important to write there. And she could write this full letter of support and really advocate for the worker to get workers' compensation. Now, another course is she could decline to write the letter she could decline to write the letter on behalf of the worker. Now, when thinking about this, if she was to, go ahead and say, I don't think I'm going to write that letter. All right. I sat back and tried to think what were some good reasons why, she might decide to go this route. And the one that kept kind of poking on my brain that I really thought of frequently is that maybe if Dr. Morgan looks at it and just, really believes that the assessment conducted by the independent psychologist was in good faith and that it's credible. And if Dr. Morgan determines, I feel like this assessment is credible, I feel like it did kind of hit on the necessary and impactful points, then I think that would be the main reason that Dr. Morgan would, not write the letter. So I believe personally that the best plan of action in this case would be for Dr. Morgan to go ahead and write that full letter of support advocating for the worker to go ahead and receive that workers' compensation on behalf of the SIP. Now, there are many reasons, but the two biggest reasons that stuck out to me when kind of going into how I might approach this situation if I were Dr. Morgan were, okay, so the assessment created by the independent psychologist, it just doesn't seem to be reliable and it doesn't seem to be credible. And the reason I say that is that, the results that the independent psychologist came up with were found to be inconsistent. So there's red flag number one. Red flag number two could be how the generalization of American Indian tribes across the United States is inappropriate because of how highly diverse they are. That is red flag number two. And honestly, there's a third one that stuck out to me. Red flag number three was, okay, well, if we know those two are in play, the mere fact that in the case study, it states that there is no current malingering instrument that has been established for members of American Indian tribes. So that was the third kind of red flag that stuck home. And I was like, okay, well, it just seems like the independent psychologist or their decision to go ahead and deem the construction worker to be malingering with their PTSD symptoms might have been not only premature, but just possibly unethical, because the fact that an assessment was created and the results were found to be inconsistent, there's an issue right there in itself. And And also, if you take into the fact, I think it's important for us as, people who follow these ethics codes to remember about cultural and cultural competency, right? So it's important to understand specific cultures and how you should, work with assessing certain things within cultures. Now, it seems like this independent psychologist really didn't take into the fact that if you are if you go into it and you try to generalize all of these American tribes together, that in itself is just an inappropriate thing to do. And you would not be able to really get any true, credible results based off of that alone. Monitoring and prevention. So this I just felt like, as far as monitoring goes, it could be monitored by Dr. Morgan with her relationship with the SIP. So she could check in and, see where things go after she decides. If she does decide to write that letter, she could kind of, sit back and follow up with the SIP and see how far the worker is getting, and, possibly, if able, maybe to look into, seeing if she could help that individual with with the PTSD symptoms that they're experiencing. Also, as far as prevention is concerned, the only way that I can see this truly being able to be prevented is if there are guidelines in place to determine malingering, or a new measure is created to appropriately assess malingering within American Indian tribes altogether. And I think that's important, once again, because the generalization of all American Indian tribes altogether across the United States is just inappropriate. And I don't think that's a good way to start off any kind of assessment that you might determine, especially within a situation of this magnitude. I feel that it can be very, very, very possibly, I go as far as to say it can even be disrespectful to assign the malingering tab onto an individual who experienced a traumatic accident, especially if there is no credible evidence to back up this malingering claim. So I thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed.